I saw her hand pause just long enough over my glass to know it wasn't an accident. And that was the moment I understood my daughter-in-law wanted me out of this house for good. But I didn't say a word. I didn't even flinch. I just smiled and kept my voice steady as I thanked her for dinner. Because after 68 years of living, you learn that the most dangerous battles are the quiet ones. The kind where the other person thinks you're too old, too tired, or too trusting to notice what's right in front of you. And Ashley had been very careful. Always the one pouring my water. Always insisting I sit and relax while she handled everything. Always watching just a little too closely to see if I finished every sip. And for weeks I told myself it was kindness, that I was lucky to have a daughter-in-law who cared, even when the house felt colder, even when my own son Daniel barely looked me in the eye anymore. Like something unspoken had settled between us, something I couldn't quite name. Not until tonight, when I watched her fingers hover over the rim of my glass just a second too long. A small movement most people would miss, but I didn't miss it. I never missed the small things, not anymore. And I realized then that every moment of weakness I'd felt lately, every dizzy afternoon, every time I had to sit down halfway up the stairs, it all started to line up in a way that made my chest feel tight. But not with fear. No, fear is loud and messy. What I felt was quiet, controlled, almost calm. Like the moment before a storm finally breaks. So I reached for my glass slowly, deliberately, letting my hand brush hers just enough to make it seem natural. And while she turned to answer something Daniel said, I switched the glasses, smooth and simple, like it was nothing at all. Because the truth is, people like Ashley rely on one thing more than anything else. They rely on you underestimating yourself. And for a long time, I had played that role perfectly. The aging mother, the one who didn't ask questions, the one who accepted whatever she was given. But tonight, as I watched her pick up the glass meant for me, her smile still perfectly in place, I realized something had changed, not in her, but in me. And I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited. Because sometimes the only way to uncover the truth is to let someone believe their plan is working, at least for a little while longer. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind finally had something it had been missing for weeks, clarity. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Every small detail begins to rearrange itself into something undeniable, something cold and deliberate. I sat at the edge of my bed, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, and I thought about every glass of water Ashley had handed me, every time she insisted on preparing my meals, every gentle suggestion that I should rest more, that I was not as strong as I used to be. And I realized it had never been about care. It had been about control, subtle and patient, like she had all the time in the world, and maybe she believed she did, because to her I was just an aging woman slowing down, someone easy to manage, someone whose voice would not be questioned if it began to fade. And that thought settled over me heavier than anything else, not the betrayal itself, but how easily she had assumed I would never notice. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen, the tile cool beneath my feet, and for the first time I looked at that space not as my home, but as a place where something had been happening right in front of me, unnoticed. I opened the cabinet where she kept the glasses, lined up neatly, identical, nothing unusual at first glance, but then I noticed the way she always chose one from the back, always the same position, always the same glass, and I reached for it carefully, turning it in my hand, studying it as if it might reveal something just by being held long enough. It did not, but it did not need to, because the truth was already forming in my mind. I moved to the sink and ran water, watching it fill the glass, clear and harmless. At least it looked that way, and I thought about how easily appearances can be trusted when you want to believe everything is fine, when you want your family to still feel like family. I set the glass down and leaned against the counter, remembering the afternoons when I felt lightheaded, the times I blamed it on age, on not eating enough, on the weather even. Excuses I had made for something that was never accidental, and I felt a strange sense of calm settle in, because fear would not help me now. Panic would only make me careless, and careless was exactly what Ashley needed me to be. I walked back to my room and opened my drawer, taking out a small notebook I had not used in years, and I began to write dates, times, small observations, every detail I could remember, because if this was a game, then I was no longer playing blindly. I was watching, recording, understanding, and the more I wrote, the clearer it became that tonight had not been the beginning. It had simply been the moment she slipped, the moment she believed she was safe enough to stop being perfect, and that was her mistake, not the act itself, but the confidence behind it, because confidence leaves traces, patterns, habits, things that can be followed if you are patient enough, and I have always been patient, much more patient than she realized. I closed the notebook and set it beside my bed, then turned off the light and lay down, staring into the darkness, listening to the quiet of a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because I had finally seen what was hiding inside it. And as I closed my eyes, I made a decision. I would not confront her, not yet. I would not ask questions or show suspicion. I would let her continue. Let her believe everything was exactly as she planned. Because the only way to understand how far someone is willing to go is to give them the space to go there. And when they do, when they finally reveal the full extent of their intentions, that is when the truth becomes undeniable, not just to me, but to everyone. And I intended to make sure of that. The next morning, nothing looked different, and that was the most unsettling part of all. The sunlight still came through the kitchen window the same way. The coffee maker still clicked on at exactly 7, and Ashley was already there when I walked in, standing by the counter with that same calm efficiency, like the night before had never happened, like she had not crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She turned when she heard me and smiled, warm, practiced, perfect, asking if I had slept well, and I returned the smile just as easily, because if there is one thing I have learned, it is that people reveal more when they believe they are not being watched. And Ashley believed exactly that. She poured my coffee, added a little cream without asking, just the way I like it, then reached for a glass of water, her movements smooth and familiar. But now I was watching every second, every choice, every pause. And there it was again, that almost invisible hesitation before she set the glass in front of me. So small it could have been nothing, but I knew better now. I thanked her and sat down, lifting the glass, but not drinking, letting it rest near my lips as if I were about to take a sip, while inside I was counting, observing, noting the way her eyes flicked toward me for just a moment longer than necessary, waiting, measuring, and that told me everything I needed to know. This was not a one-time act. This was routine, something she had done enough times to expect a result, and that meant I had time to understand, time to prepare. I set the glass down and reached for my coffee instead, taking a slow sip, giving no sign that anything was different, and she did not question it. She simply moved on, asking Daniel about his schedule, discussing plans for the weekend. All of it so normal, it would have been convincing if I had not already seen behind the curtain. Daniel barely looked at me again, answering her in short sentences, his focus entirely on her, and I wondered then how much he knew, whether he was blind to it or choosing not to see. And that question lingered as I cleared my dishes, moving carefully, deliberately, making sure not to disrupt the balance that Ashley believed she controlled, because if she sensed even the smallest shift, she might change her approach, and I needed her to stay exactly as she was. Predictable, consistent, confident. Later that afternoon, I found myself back in the kitchen, alone this time, the house quiet again, and I opened the cabinet slowly, taking out the same glass she had used that morning. I placed it on the counter and simply looked at it, not expecting it to tell me anything new, but understanding that sometimes the act of looking is what sharpens your thinking. I ran my finger along the rim, then set it aside and reached for another glass, identical in shape and size, and I placed them next to each other, studying the difference that was not visible, the difference that existed only in intention. And that was when I realized something important. Ashley was not rushing. She was building something gradual, something that would not raise suspicion, something that could be explained away as age, as fatigue, as natural decline. And that realization did not make me angry. It made me focused, because it meant she had a plan, and plans have structure, and structure can be understood. And once you understand something, you can dismantle it, piece by piece. I took a slow breath and straightened, then walked back to my room and opened my notebook again, adding more details, the timing of breakfast, the placement of the glass, the way she watched. All of it mattered now. All of it was part of something larger, and as I closed the notebook, I felt that same calm settle over me again. Deeper this time, stronger, because I was no longer reacting, I was preparing. and preparation changes everything. That evening, as I heard Ashley moving around in the kitchen again, the soft clink of glass against the counter echoing down the hallway, I did not feel fear. I felt certainty, because whatever she believed she was controlling, she was not the only one paying attention anymore. I began to notice that Ashley preferred evenings for whatever she was doing, not mornings, not afternoons, always dinner, always when the house was quiet and Daniel was relaxed, distracted by his phone or the television. And that pattern told me something important. She wanted consistency. She wanted control over the setting, the timing, the mood, because people are less observant when they are comfortable, and she was counting on that, counting on routine to hide intention. So I let the routine continue. I sat at the same place at the table. I accepted the same glass placed in front of me. I nodded at the same conversations, but inside I was measuring everything. The distance between her and the counter, the moment she turned her back, the way her hand moved just before she carried the glass over. And each night it became clearer that she was not improvising. She was following a system she trusted, and systems can be mapped. I started adjusting small things, barely noticeable changes. One evening I asked for iced water instead of room temperature, watching how quickly she adapted. Another time I stood up unexpectedly and offered to help, just to see her reaction. And in that brief second of surprise, I saw it. Not panic, but calculation. A quick shift in her expression before she smiled again and insisted she had everything under control. That told me she was not afraid of being caught. She was afraid of losing control, and that distinction mattered because it meant her confidence came from structure, not from certainty. And structure can be disrupted, but not all at once, not in a way that reveals your awareness. It has to be gradual, like hers was. So I returned to my seat and let her continue, letting her believe she had recovered the moment. Later that night, I heard her on the phone in the next room, her voice low, but not low enough. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. Phrases about timing, about waiting just a little longer, about making sure everything was in place, and I stood there in the hallway, not moving, not reacting, just listening. Because sometimes partial information is more revealing than complete sentences. It forces you to fill in the gaps, and the gaps were beginning to form a picture I could not ignore. This was not just about me feeling weak or out of place. This was about something larger, something that required preparation, patience, and a very specific outcome. I stepped back quietly and returned to my room, closing the door without a sound, and I sat down at my desk, opening the notebook again, writing down what I had heard, the tone of her voice, the urgency beneath it, the confidence she tried to maintain. All of it mattered, because it confirmed what I already suspected. She was not acting alone in her intentions, even if no one else was directly involved. Her actions were leading somewhere, towards something she believed was inevitable, and that belief was her greatest weakness. Because inevitability makes people careless, it makes them assume the end is already decided. And when someone believes that, they stop watching for change. They stop questioning small shifts, and that is where mistakes begin. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence settle around me, not as something empty, but as something full of answers waiting to be uncovered. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something close to certainty, not about what she had done, but about what I needed to do next. I would not interrupt her plan. I would not confront her or warn her or even hint that I understood. I would let it continue, let it grow, let it reach the point where it could no longer be explained away. Because the truth is most powerful when it reveals itself completely, not in fragments, not in suspicions, but in undeniable clarity. And as I listened to the faint sound of her voice still echoing from down the hall, I realized that whatever she believed she was building, I was now building something of my own, something quieter, more patient, and far more certain. The following afternoon, I decided to change nothing on the surface and everything beneath it, because by then I understood that Ashley was not simply acting on impulse. She was moving toward a result she had already imagined in detail. And people who think they know how a story ends rarely notice when someone else begins rewriting it. So I kept my voice gentle, my movement slow, even allowing myself to appear a little more tired than usual, pausing halfway up the stairs when I knew she was watching, holding the railing just a second longer than necessary, giving her exactly what she expected to see, and in return she gave me exactly what I needed. Confirmation, The way her eyes followed me not with concern but with quiet calculation. The way she asked if I felt all right but did not wait for the answer before turning away, as if my response did not matter as much as the pattern continuing. That evening I stayed in the living room longer than usual, pretending to read while the television played softly in the background, and I listened, not to the show, but to the sounds of the house, the rhythm of footsteps in the kitchen, the opening and closing of cabinets, the faint clink of glass against the counter. And when I finally stood and walked in, I did it without hesitation, without warning, stepping into the moment before she could adjust it. And for a brief second, I saw something real cross her face, not fear, but interruption. Like a line had been broken mid-sentence, she smiled quickly and asked if I needed anything. And I told her I just wanted some water, watching closely as she reached for a glass, and this time I did. Not sit down. I stayed there, close enough to see every movement clearly, forcing her to operate within a space she did not control. And that was when the pattern shifted, just slightly. Her hand hesitated longer than before, her body angled away just a bit more than necessary. And although I did not see anything obvious, the absence of ease told me more than any visible action could. She was adjusting, adapting, trying to maintain the structure she relied on, and that meant I was getting closer. I took the glass from her hand before she could bring it to the table, thanked her again, and walked away, not drinking, not reacting, just carrying it with me down the hallway. And I could feel her watching me, waiting, calculating whether I would follow the expected path, but I did not. I set the glass down in my room and closed the door, then simply stood there, looking at it, understanding that whatever she had planned depended on repetition, on me doing the same thing over and over again. And now that pattern was broken, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to introduce doubt. And doubt is something people like Ashley do not handle well, because it threatens the illusion of control they depend on. I sat down and opened my notebook again, writing everything, the hesitation, the shift in her posture, the way she reacted when the routine changed. And as I wrote, I realized something else, something I had not considered before. This was not just about removing me. It was about replacing something that required me to appear incapable, to appear as if I could no longer manage my own life. And that thought settled heavily, because it explained the patience, the gradual nature of everything she had done. She was not in a hurry because she did not need to be. She believed time was on her side, and perhaps until now, it had been. I closed the notebook slowly and leaned back, letting that realization take its place among the others. Because understanding motive changes everything. It gives direction to suspicion, purpose to observation, and clarity to action. And for the first time, I could see the outline of her plan, not in full detail, but enough to know where it was leading. And that meant I could begin shaping what would happen next, not by confronting her, not by exposing anything too soon, but by allowing her to continue just long enough to reveal the final step she believed would secure everything. Because when that moment came, when she reached for certainty, that would be the moment I would be ready. By the next day, I understood that waiting alone would not be enough. Observation had given me the outline, but I needed something more solid, something that could not be dismissed or explained away, and that meant I had to step slightly beyond watching without ever stepping into her line of sight. So I began with the smallest adjustment. I stopped drinking anything she handed me entirely, but I made it look accidental, forgetful. I would set the glass down beside me and become distracted, pick up a book, answer a question, let time pass until the moment was gone, and each time I did, I saw that same flicker in her eyes, subtle, controlled, but there, the kind of reaction that only comes when a plan depends on consistency. And that told me I was disrupting something important, something she could not easily replace. That afternoon while she was out running errands, I moved through the house slowly, not searching in a frantic way, but in the careful, deliberate way you do when you already know what you are looking for. I opened drawers I had not opened in months, cabinets that had become her domain, and I paid attention to placement more than objects, because people like Ashley do not leave obvious evidence. They leave patterns, and patterns reveal themselves through repetition, not through single discoveries. In the back of one cabinet, I found a small container I did not recognize, nothing unusual at first glance, just something that did not belong to me. And that was enough. I did not open it right away. I simply noted where it was, how it was positioned, how easily it could be reached without drawing attention. Then I closed the cabinet exactly as I found it, because the goal was never to confront the object. It was to understand the behavior around it. Later that evening, I returned to the kitchen before she did, earlier than usual, and I prepared my own glass of water, placing it at my seat. A quiet change, one that would force her to adjust again. When she walked in, she paused just slightly, noticing it. And in that pause, I saw the shift, not confusion, but recalculation. She smiled and asked if I needed anything else, and I told her no, that I had everything I needed. And for the first time, there was a moment where neither of us moved, a small silence that carried more weight than any conversation. Because it was no longer just her controlling the environment. I was part of it now, shaping it, and she knew it, even if she could not yet prove it. Dinner continued as usual. Daniel spoke about work. She responded with the right tone, the right expressions, but underneath it all there was tension, quiet, contained, but present. And I realized then that this was no longer just about uncovering her plan. It was about letting her reveal how far she would go when that plan was challenged, because pressure reveals intent faster than patience alone. After dinner, I excused myself early, carrying my untouched glass with me again, and as I walked down the hallway I felt it, that awareness behind me, the sense of being watched not out of care, but out of calculation, and I understood that she was beginning to question the pattern, to notice the inconsistencies, but she was not ready to abandon her approach. Not yet. People do not give up on something they have invested time in unless they are forced to, and I had no intention of forcing her too soon. In my room, I set the glass down and sat beside it, looking at something that once seemed so simple and now represented something far more complex. I reached for my notebook and wrote again, not just what had happened, but what had changed, because the changes mattered more than the actions themselves. They showed movement, adaptation, intention, and as I closed the notebook, I realized that I was no longer following her plan. I was guiding it, gently, quietly, leading it toward a point where it would have to reveal itself completely. And when that moment came, I would not need to ask questions or make accusations. The truth would already be there, clear, undeniable, and entirely her own doing. By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like a place where I lived. It felt like a stage, every movement rehearsed, every word measured. And I knew Ashley felt it too, even if she refused to acknowledge it. Because tension does not need to be spoken to be understood. It lingers in pauses, in glances that last a fraction too long, in the way silence stretches between ordinary sentences. And she had started adjusting more often now, small changes, subtle but consistent, like she was trying to regain control over something that was slowly slipping away, and that told me I was close, closer than she realized. That evening I made a decision, not a sudden one, but one that had been forming quietly with every observation, every note in my notebook. I would stop guiding her plan and allow it to reach its natural peak, because there comes a point where holding back only delays the inevitable, and I needed to see how far she was willing to go when she believed she was finally succeeding. Dinner was set the same as always, the table arranged neatly, the plates aligned, the soft light casting everything in a calm, familiar glow. Daniel sat in his usual place, distracted, distant, unaware or unwilling to see what had been unfolding right in front of him, and Ashley moved through the kitchen with practiced ease. But tonight there was something different, not in what she did, but in how she did it. There was confidence again, a quiet certainty that had been missing for the past few days, and I understood why. I had given it back to her. I had returned to the pattern she expected, sitting down without hesitation, allowing her to take control of the small details once more. And she responded exactly as I knew she would, her movements smoother, her pauses shorter, her attention less guarded, because to her, everything had returned to normal, and normal was where she felt strongest. I watched as she reached for the glass, the same one she always chose, the same position, the same motion, and this time I did not interrupt. I did not step closer or change the rhythm. I let it unfold exactly as she intended, because that was the only way to see the full shape of her plan. She turned slightly, her back to me for just a moment, and even without seeing every detail, I knew, not because of a single action, but because of everything that had come before, the pattern, the repetition, the confidence. It all led to this moment, She placed the glass in front of me with a soft, almost careful precision, as if setting down something more than just water. And I met her eyes briefly, offering a small, polite smile, the kind she had come to expect, the kind that told her nothing had changed, and for the first time in days, she believed it completely. We began eating, the conversation light, ordinary, almost peaceful, and I let it continue, not rushing, not forcing anything, because timing matters more than action, and when the moment came, it needed to feel natural, inevitable even. I reached for the glass slowly, lifting it just enough to catch the light, letting the surface ripple slightly, and I paused, just for a second, as if distracted by a thought, and in that second I felt her attention sharpen, subtle but immediate, waiting, measuring, expecting the next step to follow the pattern she had built, and that was when I understood that everything had aligned. Every observation, every adjustment, every quiet decision had led to this exact point, not just for her, but for me as well. I lowered the glass slightly, not drinking yet, not reacting, simply holding it there between us. And in that stillness, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. This was never about rushing to expose her. It was about allowing her to fully reveal herself, to step forward into her own certainty, without hesitation, because only then would the truth be complete, undeniable, and entirely her own. And as I set the glass back down on the table with deliberate calm, I knew that whatever happened next would not be controlled by her plan anymore. It would be defined by what she chose to do when she believed she had already won. The moment did not announce itself with noise or urgency. It arrived quietly, almost politely, like everything else in this house. I let my fingers rest lightly around the glass, not lifting it, not pulling away, just existing in that space where expectation hangs in the air, and I could feel her watching, not openly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I had learned her rhythm by now. The way her attention sharpened when she believed the outcome was within reach, and tonight she believed it more than ever. I turned my head slightly toward Daniel, asking him a simple question about his day, something ordinary, something that would shift his focus just enough, and as he answered, distracted as always, I moved my hand, slow, natural, unremarkable, sliding my glass a few inches to the side as if adjusting for comfort, and in the same motion I reached for hers, the one she had set near her own plate, identical in every visible way, and I brought it closer to me without pause, without hesitation, because hesitation is what people notice, and I had no intention of being noticed. The movement was small, almost invisible, the kind of motion that disappears inside a conversation, and when I settled my hand around the new glass, I felt it, not physically, but in the shift of the room itself, something subtle, something unspoken, like a balance had been disturbed in a way only one of us could understand. I did not look at her immediately. I let the silence stretch just enough. Then I lifted the glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes steady, my expression unchanged, and when I set it back down, I finally met her gaze, just for a moment, long enough to see it, the smallest flicker of confusion, gone almost instantly, replaced by that same composed smile she always wore. But it had been there, and that was all I needed, because confusion means something has shifted, something has moved beyond control. She reached for her own glass then, the one that now sat where mine had been. And for the first time since all of this began, there was a pause, not the calculated kind she used before, but a real one, brief, but real. And in that pause I saw the crack, the moment where certainty faltered, but she did not stop. She could not. Because stopping would mean acknowledging the possibility that something was wrong, and people, like Ashley, do not question their own plans when they are this close to the end. They push forward, they commit, they trust the structure they have built, and so she lifted the glass and took a sip, just as she had expected me to do, and I watched, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that this was no longer about suspicion or theory. This was the moment where everything she had been doing stepped into the open. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, undeniably. She set the glass down and continued speaking as if nothing had changed, her voice steady, her movements controlled. But I could see it now, the awareness beneath the surface, the subtle shift in how she held herself, the way her eyes moved just a little more carefully, scanning, recalculating, and I realized that she felt it too. not the truth itself, but the disturbance of it, the sense that something had gone off script. And that was enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, letting the conversation continue around me, because there was no need to rush, no need to interrupt what was already unfolding. The plan she had trusted, the pattern she had repeated, it had reached its turning point. And from here, whatever happened next would not be guided by her expectations anymore. It would be shaped by the consequences of the choice she had just made, a choice she believed was safe, controlled, inevitable. And as I watched her across the table, her smile still in place, her voice still calm, I understood something with absolute clarity. She no longer realized which glass had been meant for whom, and that meant she no longer understood the situation she was in. And that was the moment when everything truly began to change. She did not react right away, and that was what made it unmistakable. The way she continued speaking, the way her smile remained in place just a second too long, as if her body was waiting for confirmation that everything was still under control, but control had already slipped, and somewhere beneath that calm surface, she knew it. I watched her carefully, not searching for panic, but for the absence of certainty, and it was there, subtle but growing. The way her hand rested on the table, instead of reaching for her glass again. The way her eyes flicked toward me, and then away just a fraction too quickly. And in that moment, I understood that she was beginning to question something she could not yet define. Daniel kept talking, unaware, his voice filling the space between us. But for me, the room had grown quieter, more focused, every small movement carrying meaning, every pause revealing more than words ever could. I let a few seconds pass before I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to shift the direction of the moment. I told her that the water tasted different tonight, nothing more than a simple observation, the kind that could be dismissed if there was nothing behind it, but not if there was, and I saw it then, clearly this time. The flicker of something real, not confusion anymore, but recognition, the instant when possibility becomes reality. When a thought you tried to ignore steps forward and demands to be acknowledged. She laughed softly, a practiced sound, and said it must be the filter, that sometimes it acts up, and I nodded as if that explanation made perfect sense, because the truth does not need to be forced. It reveals itself more completely when you give it room to breathe. I leaned back slightly, my posture relaxed, my hands resting loosely in my lap, and I looked at her the same way I always had, calm, patient, unthreatening, and that was what unsettled her most, not anger, not accusation, but the absence of both, because without conflict, there is nothing to defend against, nothing to push back on, only silence, and silence leaves people alone with their own thoughts, and her thoughts were beginning to turn against her. I stood slowly, excusing myself from the table as if nothing of importance had happened, carrying my plate to the sink, moving through the familiar motions with deliberate ease, and behind me I could feel it, the shift in the room, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable, the kind of change that does not need to be seen to be understood. When I returned, I did not sit down again. I simply looked at both of them for a moment, letting that silence stretch just enough to settle into something solid. Then I spoke again, quietly, clearly, telling Daniel that I had made some notes over the past few weeks, about how I had been feeling, about the small changes I had noticed, and that I thought it would be a good idea for us to review everything together, not as an accusation, but as a conversation. And as I said it, I reached into my pocket and placed the notebook on the table, not opening it, not pointing to anything inside, just setting it there as a simple, undeniable fact, something that existed whether anyone chose to acknowledge it or not. Ashley did not move, not at first, and then she glanced at the notebook, just briefly, but that was enough, because in that glance was everything, the awareness, the calculation, the realization that whatever she had believed was hidden was no longer entirely out of reach. Daniel looked between us, confused, uncertain, sensing something he could not yet name, and I did not rush to explain it for him. I did not fill the silence with details or accusations, because this was not about convincing anyone. It was about allowing the truth to take its place naturally. And as I stood there, calm and steady, I realized that the outcome no longer depended on what I said next, or what she chose to deny. The moment had already passed, the balance had already shifted, and whatever she had been building so carefully had begun to unravel, not because I had forced it, but because she had stepped into it herself. And now there was no way back to the version of events she had relied on, only forward into whatever came next.